Hi, this is Starkey Sowers. Welcome again to another Plus Program training series offered by Clark's Nutrition and Natural Foods Market. Today's subject is going to be bone health. So with that said, I want us to think about bone tissue. Think about bone tissue and the way it affects your body, so to speak. One thing to remember about bone tissue, it's alive. It's constantly being changed on a regular basis. So we have a tendency to think of bone tissue oftentimes as just like a structural component, like a 2x4 on a house or a block wall where once you put it down or like lay it out, then that's it. It's never going to move. It's never going to change. Well, indeed, that is not actually true. Bone tissue remolds daily on a minutely basis, is constantly changing all the time. It's what we call a dynamic tissue. So it's not constantly stagnant. All right, so with that said, let's kind of look at a couple of things. What does bone tissue actually do for your body? As we said, it definitely provides what we call that structural component or that structural support. It holds up your muscle tissue. But the other thing to remember, it helps you move. Your muscles would literally just be a bunch of blobs, so to speak, if you didn't have bone tissue like holding it up. And so you'd just be like a rolling blob, no pun intended. All right. So on top of that, the other thing that does, it actually maintains what we call acid-base balance in the bloodstream. Calcium is constantly going into the bloodstream and constantly coming out, maintaining the pH balance in the bloodstream at a nice 7.15 to roughly about 7.35, which of course is the alkaline medium of the body. The other thing that bone tissue is so critical for too is the production of red and white blood cells. We have a tendency to forget about this because bone tissue, as we kind of mentioned, kind of gets sidetracked and just think, well, it's always there, no big deal, I'm not worried about it. But it actually produces your blood components. So without bone tissue, you're actually not going to have blood. So real quick review. Number one, it's going to be structure. Number two, it helps with movement. The other thing is acid-base balance. And finally, also going to be blood production. All right, so what does it take to keep bone tissue? So we've got to have nutrients into the body to make this happen. And I know you guys are already thinking, okay, he's going to talk about calcium. No question about it. We are going to talk about calcium because calcium is indeed one of the number one bone constituent pieces, so to speak. But before we get to calcium, remember that protein actually becomes the number one constituent tissue. That's right, protein. Bone actually is what we call connective tissue. So your body actually needs proteins to build up the brick, so to speak, which is the calcium. So it kind of enshrouds it or makes the whole matrix of the bone be active and actually be what we call dynamic and moving. So it's just not this rigid component. So then on top of that, phosphorus. Phosphorus is another mineral that we typically get in our average diet. And phosphorus kind of works with calcium, producing what we call hydroxyapatites. And those are the bone matrix components. Along with that, there's some minerals as well that become really critical. A little bit of magnesium, a little bit of also a good component is silica. Boron is definitely necessary for growth, and so is copper, and so is zinc. All right, so with that said, we kind of got a foundation. We know that that's there, and we've got kind of a foundation what's needed. So with that said, let's kind of look at what the number one problem with bone tissue typically is, and you guys are probably already thinking it's osteoporosis. So with that said, let's kind of pull the word apart. What does osteoporosis mean? Well, think about it. Osteo, of course, means bone, and porosis means like porous or just like kind of pores in the bone. So kind of think of a sponge, so to speak, and that's kind of when you look at bone tissue, what it looks like. And then imagine that sponge kind of thinning out. And eventually what happens is where it becomes much more brittle and easy to break. And so osteoporosis is really actually a very, what I would call just a debilitating type of disease, especially if one was to get a fracture from an osteoporotic situation. Oftentimes, this literally creates real critical imbalances with the human body. All right. So with that, let's kind of look at osteoporosis and let's kind of like maybe identify some things that might accentuate the causes of osteoporosis. Number one, eating too much sugar actually, believe it or not, has a detrimental effect. Number two, the other thing that happens is eating too much soda or drinking too much soda. The other thing is too much red meat consumption becomes a huge critical issue. Then all of a sudden, we look at the number one component, the lack of this number one component, which is exercise. Exercise actually stimulates what we call the osteoblastic cells. And those osteoblastic cells is what synthesize calcium and magnesium into the bone. So the lack of exercise becomes a critical factor. All right, so all that kind of lays it out. So finally, though, we got to look at another key issue. Osteoporosis is definitely, no question about it, a large percentage a female disorder. So when we look at that, a couple different things, specifically Asian and white females, small bone structure, become what we call a very large risk factor category for individuals that could actually potentially develop osteoporosis situations. The other thing that we got to look at as a lifestyle factor as well is smoking as well as drinking too much alcohol. Those factors, especially for females, become a huge issue. Finally, menopause. When menopause sets in, we lose the estrogens and the progesterones, which literally kind of accentuate the growth of bone tissue. That kind of wraps it up. And it's kind of like, okay, well, wait a minute. We've got all this bad news, bad news, bad news. Well, what can we do to maintain good bone tissue density? Number one, especially if you're female, especially if you're white or Asian, small bone structure, exercise becomes the number one key component to helping maintain what we call the prevention of osteoporotic situations. So when you think of exercise, think of a couple different things. Number one, walking, actually 20 to 30 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week becomes a real critical, simple, easy solution to help you prevent osteoporosis. The thing that I like the best though is weightlifting. I think weightlifting 2 to 3 times a week becomes absolutely essential because you put a lot of force on the bone. And what that does is creates what we call an anabolic environment for the bone to actually grow. And it kind of sucks in those minerals that we talked about to be able to get into the body and be able to build up that bone tissue. All right. So definitely weight-bearing exercise, in my opinion, is one of the number one things that you can do. So then let's look at the other factors and let's make sure that when it comes to sugar foods that we're not over consuming what we call refined white processed sugar foods. That's number one on the list. Number two, avoid too much, or in my opinion, just get rid of the soda. Just get rid of it. I just don't think it even needs to be there. I think it's something that you can easily eliminate. All right, so then finally, not too much red meat, and then a large amount of fruits and vegetables, especially what we call the kind of like the structure vegetables. So like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, all these different things that are kind of hard and fibrous, those things have truckloads of calcium in it. And calcium, of course, is one of the number one things that we need to have in on a daily basis. So what are some other sources of calcium that we can use? Obviously, milk products such as yogurt and kefir, cheese, cottage cheese, and things of that nature has abundance of calcium with it. So then finally, one of the things to remember as well too, is you can use calcium supplement. Calcium supplement and total amount of calcium needed for the day is going to be about 1,000 milligrams. And we also recommend, if you're using calcium, to add some extra vitamin D with it as well too. We seem to look at a couple different studies, and calcium with vitamin D seems to be much more effective for helping with bone density than just calcium on its own. So that's a real quick checklist. Number one, exercise on a regular basis. Number two, the thing that you want to do is make sure that we're eating calcium-rich foods. Number three, large amounts of fruits and vegetables, and avoidance of too much alcohol, too much sugar, and too much red meat. So that kind of wraps it up and gives us like a 1, 2, 3 punch, so to speak, with the help of the prevention of osteoporosis. This is Starkey Sowers. We thank you for watching the Plus Program training video.